It is. It's very hard for us. I think
It is. It's very hard for us, I think.
now. And with this single going out this week, if this single goes to number one on Sunday, we'll be the only band to ever have 5 number one singles consecutive with their first 5 singles. So we'll be making history. It's very, very nerve-wracking for us. I think to be in the position to try and break out into the first place is something we never dreamed we did. I think it's only came to us last year. And
First 5 seconds, making history. It's very, very nerve-wracking. I think
and it's all thanks to you guys. So thank you very much.
Class ourselves as a modern day boy band. I think we like to look at ourselves as a bit more of a vocal group than kind of bands were in the past. But I think as well as that, the whole thing about enjoying it, I think being on stage the past year has just been a total roller coaster ride for the 5 of us. You know, from 5 lads from Ireland, come across, you know, first of all breaking United Kingdom and then coming breaking Europe, Asia, and now hopefully America. It's just been amazing. You can't pinpoint one thing that's been the best. I mean, from 4 number ones to record of the year, including Christmas number 1, and then being in the position, as we've said, of breaking records is amazing. But if it doesn't happen, it doesn't happen. It's all up to people watching out there. You know what I mean? It's going to be tough. It's going to be great. It's very exciting. But you know, we won't hold our heads in shame if we don't get it.
Ryan is doing impressions. We do impressions of each other.
It's like Shane. Shane's not paying attention. He sits there and goes.
Next man.
Okay, Nicky just wakes up in the morning and goes, puts his hand in his pocket and takes out his pouch. Photographs. I can't remember the takes his head and goes, he wants to do this dance. Mark, right, you'll be sitting in the bus around with Mark, it'll be 5 minutes, just get in the door closes. Right, Mark. You wake up, you just the house.
Sitting at the bus around the mark, 5 minutes.
A sloppy dribble comes down here.
I think everybody's shooting a face of boy.
No problem.
When he sleeps, he now goes like a duck. He can never close his lips. So he sleeps with that. And it's yeah, close your eyes. His mouth goes up like his bottom lip is straight, but this lip sort of curve like this. So he's like.
Hey y'all! So as you may have seen from my most recent multi-instrumental cover in 15-tone equal temperament, I wasn't using a Porcupine keyboard layout. I was using a Hanson keyboard layout instead. I think I'm the only person I know who's created music with both layouts,
so as you may have seen
so
from
this
my most
video is a
recent
comparison
multi-instrumental
of some
cover
of the
in
techniques
15-tone
and
equal
pros and cons and
I
other
wasn't using a
observations
Porcupine
from
keyboard
professional
layout.
piano
I was using a
musicians.
Hanson keyboard layout instead.
For those of you who are new to microtonality, these alternative keyboard layouts provide a scale pattern that you can reference while playing, similarly to how the diatonic scale is referenced on the standard 12-tone equal tempered keyboard. You can see here that the white keys form a scale with 5 large and 2
These
small
alternative keyboard
steps
layouts provide a
before
scale
reaching the
pattern that you can
octave.
reference while playing, similarly to how the diatonic scale is referenced on the standard 12-tone equal tempered keyboard.
Other layouts are, of course, possible, but these two are preferable for their simplicity. In a Porcupine layout, you can see that we have 7 large and 1 small step before reaching the octave. In the Hanson layout, you can see that we have 4 large and 3 small steps before reaching the octave. The large step is 3 degrees in the Hanson instead of 2 like it was in the Porcupine and the diatonic scale. These two layouts are both very different, and both, in my personal experience, are more difficult than most of the other microtonal layouts I've used for my keyboard. The Porcupine keyboard is difficult because the black key group is so large, and the Hanson keyboard is difficult because it combines an unfamiliar layout with the somewhat foreign idea of double black key groups. Let's get started with the comparison. First, the pattern. The Porcupine pattern is simpler, and the Hanson pattern is more complex. This doesn't necessarily make one or the other better or worse. At a basic level, it means that the Porcupine pattern is easier for beginners and harder for experts, and the Hanson pattern is easier for experts and harder for beginners. The Porcupine keyboard lets you play transposed scales with nearly the same position each time, so that there are fewer positions to learn. And thus, almost all of the major triads feel like B-flat major, B major, or C major from the 12-tone keyboard. Thus, the advantage with a simpler layout is that you can jump right in, because there are fewer positions. The disadvantage is that similarity actually makes it harder for you to orient yourself and distinguish scales from one another. The more different a scale or chord is from another, the more you're going to be able to tell it apart from other similar versions, even though it takes longer to learn. In Porcupine's case, this is a big disadvantage, but I also really like that in Porcupine, the white key scale has a lot of triads in it. If you're just messing around on Porcupine black keys or white keys, it's easy to come up with triadic harmony. Whereas in Hanson, it's very hard to make this work. This simpler pattern also makes Porcupine easier to feel under the fingers. Second, subitizing. Both of these layouts cause novel black key groupings compared to what the 12-tone keyboard does. Porcupine has a distinct disadvantage here. You can see that since we have 7 black keys in one group, well, that's a lot. This large grouping is right on the edge of what I can quickly ascertain at a time by easily seeing a certain number of things. This isn't a problem with a 6-key grouping, and it's a much bigger problem, unplayable consistently in a similar vein to standard 12 equal layout, in an 8-key grouping. This just means that it's hard for me to spot the 3rd versus 4th key or the 4th versus 5th key, say. It's quite common for me to hit the wrong one if I'm not using stepwise motion, and looking most of the time. This difficulty in subitizing black keys is the main reason that I was having second thoughts about the Porcupine layout. The Hanson layout is much easier to subitize, though the pattern seems much more unfamiliar. We have 3 clear groupings of double black keys that can easily be spotted. Although it's easier to spot, its unfamiliarity seems much more daunting than other layouts because of the novelty of double black keys, which I think on the surface seems much more novel than the many more black keys in the Porcupine layout. I will also say that at rare times, my brain will want to treat the 2 single groupings here as one giant group, which is a bit problematic, since that treatment resembles the other group. I'm chalking that up to all of the training I've done in 12-tone equal temperament. Third, technique. Because of the Porcupine layout's black key pattern, there's not really a standard technique for playing legato across all the black keys. Generally, in chord arpeggiation and scale fingering, you don't want your thumb to cross onto a black key, because the black key is raised and slightly farther away from you. Exceptions occur when you're arpeggiating a triad with all black keys, such as E flat minor in 12-tone equal temperament. The real problem is dealing with stepwise motion. What would the fingering be for a Porcupine 7 scale on the black keys here? I think the best way to do it would be to cross after playing 3, just because then your hand doesn't have to cover too much distance. But at the same time, it's not constantly crossing really fast, since you can count between 2 streams. It's still a bit awkward to play legato this way. With this method, here would be a fingering for the Porcupine 7 scale starting on the first black key. In contrast, the Hanson layout could easily have more playable fingerings created for most of the scales you would need. Maybe I'll create them someday. To figure out what kind of technique has been used for large groups of black keys, I think I'll do more research into 6+6 keyboards. Maybe there's something there. My conclusion is that the Porcupine layout is much more like a Janko keyboard or a 6+6 keyboard, making it easier to play at an entry level, but more difficult to play with good technique. I also have some other tests I use to see how I acclimate to a layout. First, improvisation. How smooth and well-reasoned do my improvisations sound? Are they logical and fitting? We already have a Hanson improvisation from the Dance of the Forest Lights cover. Now here's an improvisation with Porcupine. Obviously, the difference between them is quite subjective. I'm not sure which one I really had an easier time with. You'll have to let me know in the comments.
Assalamualaikum, aku Rama dan Suci. Tahun ini, Ramadan pertama kami sebagai suami istri. Ternyata, jadi suami pas puasa itu harus...
Second, finishing a thought. Can I have a musical thought in 15 EDO and finish it on each keyboard layout? Unfortunately, since these are so spontaneous, I don't really have a control, and of course I'm not doing this in any scientific way. It's just general observation. Third, linear harmony. Can I play a simple shape across the keyboard? Some good ones that I do are descending triads, so just, a descending major chord, descending minor chord, ascending major chord, ascending minor chord. Fourth, what happens if I play music with my eyes closed? Is it even possible to find anything? In 12-tone equal temperament, I know my way around. Though, of course, large distances are harder. We'll see what happens with the Porcupine and Hanson layouts. I decided to test my ability to play with my eyes closed, not by improvising, but by playing a certain theme I came up with in 15-tone equal temperament called I Can Sing with 15 Notes, I Can Sing with 15 Notes. Thanks so much for watching this video. If you want to hear more stuff about music composition, alternative keyboard layouts, microtonal podcasting, you can always donate to my Patreon account, which is the Nouns and account, and I'll put the link in the description. I'm trying to make multi-instrumentals and harmonic covers, and lots of other sorts of music, probably choral music. So, yeah, that's pretty much what I'm up to. Anyway, thanks for watching. See you in the next video.
Hello viewers! Since I have a microtonal Halberstadt keyboard, I'm creating scale videos for equal temperaments 11 to 19, since these are small enough to be played similarly to standard tuning. Each equal temperament has its own video, and goes over 2 full scales in every key. I present what I think the most logical fingerings are, based on various criteria.
What I think the
My
most
goals
logical
were to try
fingerings
and
are,
preserve
based on
fingerings
various...
from standard 12 equal tuning, to make logical decisions about scales that are in uncharted territory technique-wise, and to create similar fingerings for all scales, so that less has to be learned. If you're a piano player, and these scales don't make sense to you, I recommend you look at the 12 equal video I did on this to compare conventions and naming schemes. In new situations involving crossing the thumb to black keys, which is sometimes necessary in these new layouts, I stuck to 2 main principles. Firstly, when crossing with the thumb, I only go from a black key to a black key. It's much easier to cross from a black key to an adjacent black key than to cross to a black key from a white key. In non-diatonic, non-heptatonic scales featuring white keys, I have tried to cross black keys using finger 2 when possible. It's simply much less awkward because the hand doesn't have to scrunch up as much for the cross, and so it can afford to be less precise. In 17-tone equal temperament, though, not only are all of the scales I've explored here heptatonic, but there are also some that use all black keys. In the diatonic scales with all black keys, I have to change my strategy not only because there are only black keys, but also because traditional diatonic fingering uses a group of 3 and a group of 4. This 3 and 4 grouping is more important to stick to than crossing to a black key on 2. So the strategy for these scales is to make sure that the cross simply doesn't happen over a whole step, usually. It's much easier to cross to a black key a half step away than one a whole step away in these scales.
Is more important
Regardless,
to stick to than
playing
crossing to a
scales
black key
legato
on 2.
is difficult
So the
enough.
strategy for these scales is to make sure that the
Diatonic
cross
scales that
simply
use
doesn't
only
happen
black
over a
keys
whole
in
step,
17
usually.
are C sharp, G sharp, D sharp, and A sharp.
E sharp,
If you would like the
D
fingering
sharp,
charts,
and A
you can
sharp.
become a patron of my podcast at the link in the description. This is the video for piano fingerings in 17-tone equal temperament. The two scales I've picked to represent this tuning are Super Pythagorean 7 and Daikon
Patron of
7.
my podcast at the link
When I
in the
play a
description.
scale, I'll highlight the
This
notes
is
from the
the
scale
video for
in pink.
piano fingerings
The
in
tonic note will be a
17-tone
slightly
equal
darker shade of pink than the other highlighted keys from the scale.
The two scales
I'll
I've
play through
picked
two
to
octaves
represent
to
this
show how
tuning are
fingers
Super
cross into the
Pythagorean.
next octave, and or how fingerings can be slightly changed at the ends of the scales to reduce crossing. Super Pythagorean is a 7-note scale with 5 large steps and 2 small steps. It's the regular temperament name for 17 tones diatonic scale.
And or how
Because the
fingerings
perfect
can be
fifth
slightly
is
changed
slightly
at the ends of
larger
the
than a
scales to reduce
Pythagorean
crossing.
or perfect fifth, we call it
Super Pythagorean is a
Pythagorean.
7-note scale with 5 large
It's
steps
the
and 2 small
alpentonic
steps.
scale of this
The regular
17-tone
temperament name
layout
for
because you
17
can play it on the white keys, like the C major scale in 12 equal. The large steps span 3 degrees of 17, while the small steps span 1
Played on the
degree
white
of
keys,
17.
like the C major
I'll
scale
be
in
playing
12
this
equal.
mode, the traditional
Large steps
Ionian
span
or
3
major
degrees of
mode.
17, while the small steps
1, 3, 3, 3, 1. Since Super Pythagorean is a 7-note scale, we can use fingerings from 12-tone equal temperaments diatonic scales. Only fingerings from 12 equals major scales are needed to play 17
Since
equals
Super
respective
Pythagorean
major
is a
scales
7-note
in every
scale,
key.
we can use fingerings from
Nearly all of the
12-tone equal
diatonic
temperaments
scales here
diatonic
use their
scales.
analogous major
Only
scale
fingerings
fingerings
from
in
12 equals
12-tone equal
major scales
temperament, except for D sharp major and A sharp major. D sharp major uses the fingering from D flat major, and A sharp major uses the fingering from B major. dicot is a 7-note scale with 4 large steps and 3 small steps. It's like a diatonic scale, but scale degrees 2, 3, 6, and 7 are all in between major and minor. The large steps span 3 degrees of
Dicot is a
17,
7-note
while
scale
the
with
small
4
steps
large steps
span
and
2
3 small
degrees of
steps.
17.
It's like a
I'll be
diatonic
playing
scale,
that
but
indicating
scale degrees
neutral
2.
mode. 2, 3, 2, 3, 2, 3, 2. Since dicot is also a 7-note scale, we can use fingerings from 12-tone equal temperaments diatonic scales. Only fingerings from 12 equals diatonic scales, some major and some minor,
2, 3,
are needed
2,
to play
3,
17
2,
equals
3,
dicot
2.
scales in every key.
Since
Most of the
dicot is
dicot
also a
scales here
7-note
use their
scale,
analogous
we can
major
use
scale
fingerings from
fingerings
12-tone
in
equal
12-tone
temperaments
equals
diatonic scales.
except for G flat,
Only fingerings
A
from
flat,
12 equals
A flat,
diatonic scales.
B flat, and A sharp. A flat, E flat, and B flat dicot just use their respective natural minor fingerings instead of their major ones. G flat and A sharp dicot both use the fingering from E flat major.
Just use their respective natural minor fingerings instead of their major ones.
Thanks for watching. If you would like to support giant, extravagant microtonal cover songs, keyboard arrangements of Easley Blackwood's microtonal etudes, microtonal podcasting, educational videos on ear training and modes, or my composition, you can donate to my Now and Zen Patreon account. I need
Thanks
60
for watching.
patrons by
If you would
December
like to
1st,
support
2020
giant, extravagant
to continue my
microtonal cover
microtonal
songs,
podcast,
keyboard
Now
arrangements
and
of
Zen.
Easley Blackwood's
It's always
microtonal etudes,
appreciated.
microtonal
This video is
podcasting,
made possible
educational
by my
videos on
Zen Harmonic patrons, as well as my Zen Harmonic gods, Adam Fries, Matthew Sheeran, Vincenzo Sicarella, Kit Dugay, Hector McGuffin, Christopher Bailey, Leland O. Weigel, Amy Coleman, Jill Weigel, Tina Harmon Carteau, and the Brass Whisperer. You are
as
all
well
so
as my Zen
appreciated.
Harmonic gods.
Thank you for
Adam Fries,
funding these
Matthew
educational
Sheeran,
resources and
Vincenzo
what I do.
Sicarella,
See you in
Kit
the next
Dugay,
video.
Hector McGuffin, Christopher Bailey, Leland O. Weigel, Amy Coleman, Jill Weigel, Tina Harmon Carteau,
Boost
and
your
the
mobile game's revenue with rewarded ads. Unlike regular ads, rewarded ads are a part of the game. They're not.
game's revenue with rewarded ads.
Why
Unlike
does a
regular ads,
piano
rewarded ads
and
are a
Western
part of the
music
game.
in
They're
general
not.
have 12 different notes? Why not 10 or 14 or 27? What's the logic behind musical scales and how do we build one? To answer these questions, we need to embark on a fascinating journey through the intertwining worlds of physics, history, and human perception.
What's the logic behind
The reason we have harmonic systems at all is that certain combinations of frequencies sound better to us than others. For example, it's a pretty safe bet that you find this chord more pleasant than that one. But why is that? Let's take a look at the vibration of a string. We all know that the length of a string will influence its frequency. This relationship is actually pretty straightforward. If we cut the string in half, the frequency doubles. This mathematical ratio of 2 to 1 is what we call an octave in musical terms. That's why when I put my finger in the middle of my guitar string, I get the same note, only an octave higher. It also means that if I know the frequency of this A on my piano, I can determine the frequency of all other A's by multiplying or dividing this frequency by a factor of 2. Now, this also means that an octave cannot be defined as a specific distance in frequency. The difference between the two A's in the center of our piano is 220 Hz. However, the octave between the lowest two A's spans less than 30 Hz. And between the highest two A's, we have an incredible 1700 something Hz. Yet all of these distances are an octave, with the same number of keys in between. Why? Because what matters is not the absolute frequency distance, such as 220 Hz, but the ratio between the two notes. So when we talk about musical intervals, such as an octave or a fifth or a fourth, we always mean the mathematical relationship between two frequencies. Now let's go back to our string. The tone we perceive when we pluck a string is its fundamental frequency. At this particular frequency, the string is forming a single wave between its two endpoints. However, in reality, the vibration pattern of a string is usually much more complex, because it also resonates at integer multiples of its fundamental frequency at the same time. That sounds complicated, but it immediately begins to make sense when we look at the wave patterns of these frequencies, so-called modes of a string. This is what our string looks like when we double our fundamental frequency. And here is a string vibrating at 3 times its fundamental frequency. Times 4. Times 5. Etc. It turns out that these simple mathematical relationships not only make sense visually, they also sound good to our ears. When we play the fundamental note and the first 5 overtones at the same time, we get a beautiful major chord. We can also derive the most important musical intervals from this overtone series. The relationship between the fundamental note and the first overtone is an octave. Between the first and second overtone, a perfect fifth. After that, a perfect fourth. A major third. A minor third. So the overtone series tells us a lot about the connection between mathematics and music, and it gives us a number of important intervals that probably appear in every traditional harmonic system on this planet. But how do we get from these intervals to a musical scale? In principle, you can imagine the space within an octave like a color wheel, a continuous spectrum with an infinite number of values to pick from. So in order to build a musical scale, the question is, how many notes do we fit in an octave, and what ratios do they have? As a starting point, it seems to make a lot of sense to begin with the simple ratios we found in our overtone series. In fact, it's very easy to create diatonic scales with these ratios, such as a major scale and a minor scale. This system became known as just intonation, and it's the foundation of many ancient harmonic systems around the world. One could argue that these are the most perfect scales with the purest intervals. When we combine the notes from our major and minor scale, we notice that some of them are much further apart than others. So it might make sense to fill those gaps, once again using simple ratios from our overtone series. And voila! A 12-note scale seems to do the job pretty well. So, based on the physical reality of our overtone series, a 12-note scale seems to make a lot of sense. When we tune a piano in this way, the major and minor scale sound perfect, and so do these chords. Now let's listen to an F-sharp major chord.
The major and minor scale sound perfect,
Ouch.
and so do these
Turns
chords.
out there's a huge problem. Just intonation only works for the fundamental
Now
note
let's listen
we
to
started
an
from.
F-sharp major chord.
As soon as we switch to different keys, our intervals stop making sense. Obviously, this limits our possibilities of musical expression. So, unfortunately, the idea of a perfect scale
As we
doesn't
switch
really
to
work
different
in
keys,
practice.
our intervals stop
Let's try
making
something
sense.
else. Instead of using
Obviously,
different
this
ratios
limits
from our harmonic
possibilities of
series,
musical
we
expression.
build a scale based on a single
Unfortunately,
interval,
the idea
perfect fifth. You can try this yourself on a piano, when you begin on the lowest C and move upwards in a chain of fifths. You will land on 12 different notes, before finally landing on C again, closing the circle.
Closing the circle.
If you move all of those notes into the same octave, you get exactly the 12 different keys we have on our piano, a perfect chromatic 12-tone scale. The circle of fifths is an important concept in music theory,
All
an
of
easy
those
guide
notes into
through
the
all
same
notes and
octave.
keys of
You
our
get exactly
12-tone
the
system.
12 different keys we
So
have on
once
the
again,
piano.
it looks like we
Perfect
stumbled upon a
chromatic 12-tone
perfect
scale.
harmonic system
The
of
circle
12
of
different
fifths
notes.
is an important concept
Unfortunately,
in music.
there's a catch. When we tune an instrument using a chain of perfect fifths, so-called Pythagorean tuning, we kind of neglected
tune an
all the other
instrument
intervals
using a
we
chain
care
of
about,
perfect
and it
fifths,
turns out some
so-called
of them
Pythagorean
are far
tuning.
from perfect.
Perfect.
Especially the major third is noticeably sharper
Especially
compared
the
to the
major
pure
third
interval
is
we
noticeably
had
sharp.
in just intonation.
Just
Hear the difference?
hear the
But there's an even bigger problem. Each time we jumped upwards in our chain of fifths, mathematically
problem.
we multiplied
Each
our
time we
frequency
jumped
by the
upwards in our
perfect
chain of
ratio
fifths.
of 3 to 2 or
3 to 2.
1.5. At the same time, we moved up 7 octaves from C to C, so we also doubled our original frequency 7 times. And here we run into a problem. These two numbers are not the
At the same
same.
time, we moved up
In
7
reality,
octaves
by
from C
stacking
to C.
perfect fifths,
So we also
you
doubled
don't end
our
up
original
exactly
frequency
where you started.
7 times.
So in order to close the
Here
circle,
we run
one of
into
the
a problem.
intervals in your
These
chain
two
of perfect fifths has to
Perfect
be, well, not
Well-
perfect. Unfortunately, this creates an interval which sounds so terrible that it became
Which
known
sounds so
as the
terrible.
wolf interval. So, how do we solve this? Music history is full of attempts to adjust the 12-tone scale in different ways to avoid
12-tone
the
scale
issues we
in different
saw.
ways.
This includes mean tone temperament, well temperament, and even complicated instruments with different keys for the same note. However, the basic problem remained. Perfect tuning for one key always leads to dissonance in another.
Always leads to
This changed with a radical new approach. Equal temperament really doesn't care about pure intervals.
this
The
change
only thing
with
we want to
radical
keep
new approach.
is the ratio of our octave to
Really
the 1.
doesn't care about
Besides
pure
that,
intervals.
we basically gave up on the idea of simple mathematical ratios. Instead,
basically
our
gave
modern
up
tuning
on the
system
idea
is
of
based
simple
on the idea
mathematical
that our
ratios.
entire scale should be built out of identical intervals.
Entire
So
scale
if we
should be
stick
built
with
out
12
of
notes in an
identical
octave,
intervals.
that means with each step we need to change our frequency
That
by the
means
12th
with each
root
step
of
we
2,
need to change
which
our
is a
frequency.
really unattractive irrational number compared to the pure ratios we used before. The advantage is that now intervals are the same in all keys,
Are the
allowing
same
for
in
free
all
transposition. The downside is that, except for the octave, not a single interval is perfect anymore. And you can actually hear the difference between a major chord
Downside
in
is
equal
that,
temperament
except for the
and the
octave,
same chord with pure ratios.
Here's the easiest way to learn how to play the piano. Step 1. Download Simply Piano. Step 2.
And the same
Here's the
chord
easiest way
with
to learn how to
pure
play the piano.
ratios.
Step 1. Download Simply Piano. Step 2.
So, whatever we do, it turns out we always need to compromise in some way. And this might actually be the most important lesson here. A perfect harmonic system simply doesn't exist. And there's no way to prove that one system is better than
It
another.
turns out we
The
always
fact
need
that
to
we find so many
compromise in some
different
way.
scales and musical
This might actually
systems
be
around
the
the
most
world
important lesson
is a
here.
beautiful
A
testament
perfect
to the
harmonic
curiosity
system
and
simply
creativity
doesn't
of
exist,
humans
and there's no
over
way to
thousands of years. In theory, equal temperament opens the door to all kinds of new scales.
In
By
theory,
applying the
equal
same
temperament
mathematical
opens-
principle, we can construct equal scales with any number of notes. But it turns out that 12 notes actually gets us pretty close to the pure
12
intervals
notes actually
that
gets
we
us
want
pretty
in our
close.
scale. And we would need a much higher number to get even closer. Given that mathematical perfection is impossible, 12 notes provide a good compromise between
And we would need
almost
a much
consonant
higher number
intervals
to get
and
even
not
closer.
too many notes.
Given that
Overall,
mathematical
it seems like
perfection
12 is a
impossible,
pretty good number
12 notes
to structure
provide a
things.
good compromise.
The colors on a color wheel, months in a year, numbers on a clock, zodiac signs, 12 Greek Olympian gods,
12
the
Greek
biblical
Olympian
12 tribes of Israel, a dozen eggs in a case. It can be divided by 2, 3, 4, and 6. 12 notes are enough to allow for endless musical complexities, while not being too overwhelming or intimidating to learn in the first place. Finally, a major reason for keeping a traditional harmonic system alive is exactly that, tradition. If we decided to switch to a tuning system with a different amount of notes, that would not only require everyone to adapt a new system of music notation and theory, but also a redesign or modification of the instruments we want to play. One of the greatest aspects of studying music and learning an instrument is the way it connects us to people and ideas of other eras. I can play a piece that somebody wrote hundreds of years ago, using the same musical scale, that I find on the modern-day
studying
electric
music
piano.
and learning an instrument is the way it connects us to people and ideas of other
So,
viewers.
all things considered,
I can play Pete,
I think
but
our
somebody
12-note
wrote
scale
hundreds of years
is a
ago
reasonable
using
choice. And I'm pretty sure that these 12 notes are here to stay.
And doesn't. Hello, all. Hello, all. Since I have a microtonal Halberstadt keyboard, I'm creating scale videos for equal temperaments 11 to 19, since these are small enough to be played similarly to standard tuning. Each equal temperament has its own video and goes over two full scales in every key.
Keyboard, I'm
I
creating
present
scale
what I think the
videos
most
for equal
logical
temperaments
fingerings
11 to
are,
19,
based on various
since these are small
criteria.
enough to be played
My
similarly
goals
to
were to try and preserve fingerings from standard 12 equal tuning, to make logical decisions about scales that are in uncharted territory technique-wise, and to create similar fingerings for all scales, so that less has to be learned. If you're a piano player and these scales don't make sense to you, I recommend you look at the 12 equal video I did on this to compare conventions, naming schemes,
and to create similar fingerings
in
for all
new
scales,
situations
so that less has
involving
to be
crossing
learned.
the thumb to
If you're a
black
piano
keys, which is sometimes necessary in these new layouts, I stuck to two main principles. Firstly, when crossing with the thumb, I only go from a black key to a black key. It's much better to cross from a black key to an adjacent black key than to cross to a
Which
black
is
key
sometimes
from
necessary
a
in
white
these new
key.
layouts. I stuck to two
Secondly,
main
I tried to cross onto
Firstly,
black
when
keys
crossing
using
with the
finger
thumb,
2 when
I only
possible.
go from a black key
It's simply
to
much
a black
less
key.
awkward because the
It's much
hand
better to
doesn't
cross
have to
from a
scrunch up
black
as much
key
to cross,
to an adjacent
and so
black
it
key.
can afford to be less precise. If you would like the fingering charts, you can become a patron of my podcast at the link in the description. This is the video for piano fingerings in 11-tone equal temperament. The two scales I've picked to represent this tuning are Orgon 7 and Machine 6. When I play a scale, I'll highlight the notes from the scale in pink. The tonic note will be a slightly darker shade of pink than the other highlighted keys from the scale. I'll play through 2 octaves to show how fingers cross into the next octave, and or how fingerings can be
When
slightly
I play a
changed
scale,
at the ends
I'll
of the
highlight the
scales
notes
to
from the
reduce
scale in
crossing.
pink. The tonic note will be a slightly
Orgon
darker
is a
shade of
7
pink
note
than the
scale
other
with
highlighted
4
keys
large
from the
steps
scale.
and 3 small
I'll play
steps.
through 2 octaves
The
to show
large
how
steps
fingers
span
cross
2
into the next
degrees of
octave,
11,
and or how
while the small steps span 1 degree of 11. I'll be playing this mode 2-1-2-1-2-2-1. Since Orgon is a 7-note scale, we can use fingerings from 12-tone equal temperaments diatonic scales.
while the small
Only
steps
5
span 1
fingerings
degree of
from
11.
12 equal
I'll be
diatonic
playing
scales
this
are
mode
actually needed to play Orgon 7 in every key.
2-1-2-1-2-2-1.
The fingerings
Since
from
Orgon
F,
is a
G
7-note
flat,
scale, we
D
can use
flat,
fingerings
B
from
flat
12-tone
minor,
equal temperaments.
and B. Here are the scales.
Here are the scales.
Machine is a 6-note scale with 5 large steps and 1 small step. It's the Albitonic scale of this
Albitonic
11-tone
scale.
layout, because you can play it on the white keys, like
it on
the
the
C
white
major
key.
scale in 12 equal. The large steps span 2 degrees of 11, while the small step spans 1 degree of 11. I'll be playing this mode, 2 2 2 2 2 1. Since machine is a 6-note scale, there's 2 logical ways to split things up to repeat every octave.
Machine
You can
is a
split
6-note
fingerings
scale.
into groups
There's
of
2
3
logical
plus
ways
3,
to split things up to
or
repeat
4
every
plus
octave.
2. I also tried to do it in such a way that certain chunks of the scale feel familiar to other diatonic scales. Because of my guidelines
I
about
also
black
tried to
keys,
do it in such a
any
way
scale
that
that
certain
crosses
chunks
to
of
a
the
black
scale
key
feel
is
familiar to
automatically
other
a 4
diatonic
plus
scales.
2, since it crosses to 2 on the necessary cross there. There are some 4 plus 2 fingerings that don't cross to a black key for ease of playing.
Since it crosses to 2 on the necessary cross there. There are some 4 plus 2 fingerings that don't cross to a black key for ease of playing.
Thanks for watching. If you would like to support giant, extravagant microtonal cover songs, keyboard arrangements of Easley Blackwood's microtonal etudes, microtonal podcasting, educational videos on ear training and modes, or music composition, you can donate to my Now and Zen Patreon account. I need 60 patrons by December 1st, 2020 to continue in my microtonal
Arrangements of Easley
podcast,
Blackwood's
Now and
microtonal
Zen.
etudes,
It's always
microtonal
appreciated.
podcasting,
Here is the
educational
link
videos on ear
in the
training and
description.
modes, or music
This
composition.
video is
You
made
can
possible
donate
by
to
my
Now
Zen
and Zen
Harmonic
Patreon
patrons,
account.
as
I
well as
need
my
60
Zen
patrons by
Harmonic
December 1st, 2020.
gods, Matthew Sheeran, Kit Dugay, Hector McGuffin, Christopher Bailey, Leland O. Weigel, Amy Coleman, Jill Weigel, Tina Harmon Carteau, and the Brass Whisperer. Thank you all
Matthew
very much.
Sheeran,
Looking
Kit
forward to the
Dugay,
next video.
Hector McGuffin, Christopher Bailey, Leland O. Weigel, Amy Coleman, Jill Weigel, Tina Harmon Carteau, and the Brass Whisperer.
If you hate the way that your voice sounds, or maybe you just
Typical West. In typical Western music, we write all of our music using only 12 unique notes. C, C sharp, D, D sharp, E, F, F sharp, G, G sharp, A sharp, and B.
Typical Western music.
Of course, on an instrument like the piano, we have far more than 12 keys to play. But each of these keys is just a different version of one of those 12 unique pitch classes. However, like I explored in my previous video on microtonality, there are actually more than 12 unique pitch classes that we could choose from. Notes like C half sharp, or C half flat. In fact, pitch is a spectrum with arguably an infinite amount of different notes available. So why do we only use these 12? Well, the first thing to bear in mind here is that these notes weren't selected for their particular frequencies. The frequencies themselves aren't actually the important thing when it comes to making music. For example, we could sharpen all of these pitches, and as long as we sharpen them all by the same amount, the piano will still sound just as harmonious as usual. It's not the frequencies of the notes that are important, it's the intervals between those frequencies. A melody isn't really a sequence of notes, but a sequence of intervals. Twinkle Twinkle Little Star isn't defined by being these notes, or even these frequencies, but by being these intervals. You can choose any pitch for the first note, and then as long as you apply this order of intervals, you'll get Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. That's why if we transpose a song to a different key, it will still sound like the same song. So, going back to the initial question, why does Western music only use 12 notes? Well, put shortly, it's because these 12 notes are the most practical and effective way to play all of the intervals that we find useful for music making. So, what are these useful intervals? And why is 12 notes in an octave the best way to access them? Even though musical intervals are technically subjective, most humans will agree on the same handful of pitches as the most consonant, as the most pleasing and musical. It's widely accepted that the octave is the most consonant and most important interval in music. Notes an octave apart sound so good together, so complementary, that they are actually perceived as deeper or higher versions of the exact same note. This is called octave equivalence, and is why notes an octave apart are given the exact same name as each other, for example A and A. The interval of an octave is also the simplest relationship we can have between the two frequencies.
And it's why notes an octave apart are given the exact same name as each other, for example A.
So an octave up from 220 Hz is 440 Hz, a 2-to-1 relationship. This also means that a string that is half the length of another will sound exactly an octave higher, as it will vibrate twice as fast. Because notes an octave apart are perceived as different versions of the same note, most tuning systems around the world, including the Western 12-tone system, prioritize the octave and then find a way to divide the octave up into different notes. The Western way of dividing the octave into 12 different notes does a great job of allowing us access to our most important musical intervals. So let's go through those intervals now and add them onto this keyboard. The next two most consonant intervals are generally considered to be the perfect fifth and the perfect fourth. Now, of course, we're only really choosing these intervals because they just sound nice to our ears. However, interestingly, just like how the octave had a simple relationship between its two frequencies, the perfect fifth and the perfect fourth also have very simple relationships between the two notes. To go up an octave, we multiplied the frequency by 2. Instead, for a perfect fifth, we multiply it by 1.5. Or for a perfect fourth, we multiply it by 1 1/3. Of course, like I said before, we're not consciously choosing these intervals because of these simple relationships, but it turns out that the more consonant an interval sounds to us, the simpler the relationship between its two notes. And this, as you would imagine, is not a coincidence. When two frequencies are related to each other by a simple relationship, like 2-to-1, the wavelengths of those frequencies are going to perfectly line up, perfectly synchronize. And it's generally considered that this perfect alignment of the frequencies is why these intervals are perceived as consonant to us, why they're perceived as harmonious. If we play two notes that don't synchronize together like this, you can hear the dissonance.
If we play two notes that don't synchronize together like this, you can hear the dissonance.
Are widely considered the most consonant and pleasing intervals. After these three, though, the order in which different people may rank the remaining intervals will start to vary. However, it will generally follow an order similar to this: the major third, the minor third, the major sixth, and the minor sixth. And as you may have guessed, these intervals once again have simple relationships to the initial note. So we now have all of the intervals that are generally considered consonant. The remaining intervals offered in the 12-tone Western system are considered to be dissonant, but this doesn't mean that they're not useful to us. Although dissonance in music seems like something you'd want to avoid, music without any dissonance at all may sound pleasant, but will lack any drama or suspense. It won't have a sense of tension and release. So let's add the traditionally more dissonant intervals. These are the tone, or major second, the minor seventh,
These are the tone, or
the
major
tritone,
second, the minor
the
seventh,
major seventh,
major seventh,
and the semitone, or minor second. So these are the 12 intervals available to us in the Western 12-tone system. But why can't we just add a couple extra pitches in between a few of these? For example, a neutral third, which would be between the major and minor third. Or we could have a note between the major seventh and the octave, creating a sort of ultra seventh or ultra leading tone.
Neutral third, which would be between the major and minor third.
The thing is though, we can't really just add these two extra
Or we could have a
microtone
note
intervals
between the
and
major
leave it at
seventh
that.
and the octave.
This is because
creating a
it's
sort
quite
of ultra
important
seventh
that
or
the notes
ultra leading
between
tone.
the octave are more or less equally spaced. This allows us
Are
to
more or
easily
less
play in different
equally
keys,
spaced.
and generally makes the instrument much easier to play. With the
And
standard
generally makes the
12
instrument
pitches
much
in the
easier to
octave,
play.
the notes are naturally spaced at fairly equal distances from each
The
other.
notes are naturally
But
spaced
if we
at
add
fairly
just a
equal
couple microtonal notes in like this, it will destroy that equal spacing. If we're going to add more notes beyond the standard 12, we will need to find an alternative way to evenly divide up the octave, which can still allow us to play all of the most important intervals, like the perfect fifth, the perfect fourth, etc. 19 notes in the octave is a fairly good alternative. 19 evenly spaced notes in the octave still allows us to play our most important intervals, like the perfect fifth, the perfect fourth, etc., whilst also allowing us to access a whole range of other microtonal
the perfect
notes.
fifth, the perfect fourth, etc.
Another option is to have 24 notes in the octave, adding a new microtonal note between each of our standard 12 pitches. This of course maintains all of our standard intervals, whilst adding a whole range of new microtonal notes.
Another option is to have 24 notes in the octave, adding a new microtonal note between
Some musicians have written music using systems like these. Ivan Wistengradsky, for example, developed a quarter-tone piano, which features 24 notes per octave. But as you can see, having access to these extra notes makes the instrument significantly more confusing to play. Even though 19 notes per octave or 24 notes per octave allow us to play a whole range of additional microtonal intervals, I think most musicians would agree that these extra microtonal notes are not useful enough to warrant reducing the playability.